Final Fantasy Type 0, formerly a PSP game released in Japan in 2011, finally closed the book on a years-long saga for frustrated RPG fans with its HD US release. However, Type 0 isn't the only game to linger so long in a state of uncertainty. Let's celebrate these minor triumphs of localization by taking a look back at the games that barely made the long run from Japan. Super Mario Bros. 2. Did you know Super Mario Bros. 2 is actually a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic? For many of us, this little quote stood as the first piece of video game trivia we ever heard, and evidence that Nintendo wasn't always honest with its audience. So why did Nintendo choose to give us a different Super Mario Bros. 2? Most likely, Nintendo still had the recent console crash fresh in their minds, and feared a Super Mario sequel that looked and played just like its predecessor would give consumers video game malaise all over again. So the company kept the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2 hidden until they had no choice but to acknowledge it with 1993's Super Mario Bros. All-Star compilation. Much rejoicing from Nintendo fans was heard, followed by the sound of countless controllers being shattered across America. Castlevania Rondo of Blood. For a very long time, Castlevania Rondo of Blood was kind of the holy grail, a nearly unmatched piece of nerd cred for American gamers. To play Rondo of Blood, you had to import not just the game, but the hardware as well. In this case, the rather obscure PC Engine CD. Add it all up, and this piece of gamer arcana could cost you upwards of $500. Hoping to capitalize on Rondo of Blood's popularity, Konami released an update port for the PlayStation Portable in 2007. This version wasn't perfect, replacing Rondo of Blood's attractive sprites with rather ugly 3D models, but still, it was better than nothing. Metal Gear. Strangely enough, 1998's Metal Gear Solid stood as the first real Metal Gear game to be released in America. For a series so reliant on its own history, the lack of a proper Metal Gear release made several significant references of the Solid series completely fly over the heads of poor, ignorant Americans like you and me. Thankfully, the 2006 release of Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence filled this gap in the Hideo Kojima beloved series by bringing Americans Metal Gear and its sequel for the first time ever. Yes, these weren't emulations of the original MSX2 versions, instead they're reworkings of previous mobile ports, but still they're pretty faithful. Definitely more than Metal Gear's NES port. Final Fantasy II. Final Fantasy II almost made it to the US back in the day. Not only did Square promote it at trade shows, they even had a working localization for it. But due to the initial delay in getting the first Final Fantasy into English, Final Fantasy II was unreasonably dated by the time the US release rolled around. So Square just changed Final Fantasy IV's name to Final Fantasy II, and the series jumped directly to 16-bit power for its first follow-up, so far as Americans knew. A decade later, of course, Sony lined up the international release dates and numeration for the series with Final Fantasy VII, and Square began filling in the gaps of localization. That meant retitling Final Fantasy IV with its proper Roman numeral and bringing over Final Fantasy II via a PlayStation remake, packaged with the first game as Final Fantasy Origins. While still a controversial entry in the series, at least its delayed launch recontextualized it as a weird historical curiosity rather than a game that turned young Americans off from RPGs forever. Final Fantasy III. The delay that affected Final Fantasy II's release spoiled things for its sequel, Final Fantasy III, which also debuted on the 8-bit Famicom console. For various reasons, we've never seen a proper recreation of the original 8-bit Final Fantasy III. In fact, it was the only pre-Final Fantasy VII title in the series not to show up on PlayStation. Instead of getting a straightforward port of the game alongside the other 32-bit Final Fantasy remakes, Americans didn't get to play the original Final Fantasy III until some of its original designers banded together to create a comprehensive reinvention of the game for Nintendo DS. While closely based on the original Final Fantasy III's content and design, the DS game nevertheless took tremendous liberties with its source material. Debate ranges whether or not this remake was better than the original, but it certainly was more palatable for the 2006 era tastes. Dragon Quest V. Dragon Quest V had the misfortune of releasing just as Enix's American branch decided to distance itself from the series. After Enix of America closed its doors in 1995, Dragon Quest didn't get another shot in America until the 2001 US release of Dragon Warrior 7, which failed to convince RPG fans they missed all that much during the series' American absence. Part 5 would eventually see a PS2 upgrade, but since Square Enix didn't get behind Dragon Quest in the USA until the 2005 release of Dragon Quest VIII, we Americans saw another chance to play this classic RPG slip right through our fingers again. Dragon Quest's surprising move to the DS in the late aughts inspired Nintendo to give the series another push in America and took on publishing duties for Dragon Quest IX, as well as the remake for Part 6. And even though the game took a good 2 decades to reach us, this chapter of Dragon Quest aged like fine wine, netting high scores from critics who never encountered it before. Monster World 4. To be fair, Monster World was never all that popular in the US. The NES mutation, Adventure Island, is probably known best. That's a real shame though, because these Metroidvanias offer plenty of fun and cutesy charm. But by 1994, as the console wars reached a fever pitch, apparently that wasn't enough for Sega of America. Even though Monster World 4 stands as an amazing display of classic 2D sprite art, Donkey Kong Country established a new standard, and Sega had no choice but to respond with their own misguided attempts at pre-rendered graphics. As the year passed and digital distribution services steadily introduced a new generation of fans to the Monster World series, we could only wonder if somehow that lost 4th entry would ever reach us. But in mid-2012, the unthinkable happened. A fully translated version of the game appeared on Nintendo's Virtual Console, and soon after, Xbox Live and PSN. Star Odyssey. 22 years has got to be some kind of world record. While Star Odyssey strains the rules somewhat, having launched more than a decade after Sega stopped officially licensing Genesis games, it nevertheless received a legitimate cartridge release in America with the blessing of the original creators. So we're counting it. Super Fighter Team made its mark in the retro game collector world with the US localization of an obscure Taiwanese RPG for Genesis called Beggar Prince, and Star Odyssey went a step beyond that. It took Blue Almanac, a game developed by Hotbeat in the early 90s, and gave it a low-run physical release complete with English localization in the US more than a decade later. While not a particularly great or desirable RPG, it nevertheless deserves a credit for taking so much of its sweet time coming overseas. And that concludes our list of 8 Japanese games that took their time coming to America. What about you guys? What games did you wait the longest for? Or are there still games you're waiting for? Let us know in the comments below. If you like this video, support us by liking and subscribing, and you can always catch up with us at usgamer.net.